All right, hi everybody, Professor Jeff here, back again for another video. We're going to continue with The River Speaks by Professor Jeff Noor. Today we're going to look at Chapter 2, and you can see here in the title, How Readers Work, How Writers Work. And again, you can read along in your own copy of the book. You can follow me on the screen. You can just listen to the audio, whatever is best for you. But I'm going to begin here on page 9, Chapter 2. Writers and readers usually come at poetry from two different angles. Writers struggle to capture their own world, or a fictional world, as poetic, and relay an emotional or intellectual experience to the reader. And they do this using the craft of poetry the way a woodworker uses chisels, saws, dowels, and other tools and instruments of the trade. Poets are constantly looking at the world as a poetic place, a trip to the grocery store, a walk with the dog, or getting the kids out of the house and to school in the morning might all hold poems. So the poet sits down and attempts to articulate their world in an art form that will compound that experience emotionally or intellectually for the reader. I'm just really going to highlight here that this experience of emotionally or intellectually, right? We all tend to think of poetry as only about our feelings, but of course, if a poem makes us think about something in a new way, that can absolutely be a part of a poetic experience as the reader as well. Now, one of the most difficult things a writer has to do is to make a poem mean something to the reader. We can assume that a poem will be transferring some emotional or intellectual weight to the reader. As a result, this is important because then we can assume that there's some meaning to the subject matter or objects in the poem. And digging into the poem to decipher meaning is the requisite duty of the reader. And there's this Jim Harrison quote here at the corner. As a writer, I'm the bird, not the ornithologist. And again, ornithologists are people who study birds. So in this case, the poet is saying, I am the bird, right? I'm not studying myself, I'm just having the experience. As Professor Noor says here, the quote by Jim Harrison, which begins this chapter, is an apt one for knowing the space we occupy as a reader and how we might approach things. When he states that, quote, as a writer I'm the bird, not the ornithologist, Mr. Harrison tells us a great deal about how a writer works. When we sit back and watch birds, we see the birds simply going about their birdy business. They might be scouring seeds from the ground, filling their gullet with gravel, pulling worms or insects from the grass, possibly protecting a nest. That's just a bird's day. All of these actions are with purpose, but are also simply a task in their day. Yet, as the ornithologist, we sit back and take note and then ask questions. Why are they eating that type of food? Why does a male grouse exhibit a certain wing flapping as a mating technique? Why, when the killdeer is in danger, does it use a specific call? And who is the bird calling? And when we attempt to answer these questions, we look at many different factors: trends in the bird's behavior, changes in food availability during different seasons, common behavior among many killdeer during perceived danger. This is like looking at many poems by the same poet. So again, I'm just going to highlight here trends, changes, common behavior. Again, just things to be aware of, right? The expectation is not that you're going to become some expert in poetry, but it's very helpful to start to be aware of the types of questions that can help you understand perhaps the intended meaning of the poem, and also help you understand your own response to the poem, right? Because that's what chapter 1 was all about, is how do we meet a poem as the reader? Right? So it's not just about asking questions to understand what the author wanted you to know, right? The one right answer that I like to talk about so much. It's when you start to become aware of the questions you can ask yourself to understand, wait, how am I responding to this poem and why am I responding to this poem, right? And these are some of the ideas that Professor Noor is getting at here with the bird and the ornithologist quote from Jim Harrison. So, as a reader, we are constantly and certainly analyzing a poem based on what we think is embedded in the words and why. We might look to other poems by the same author. We might use some knowledge of the writer's life. We may use some knowledge of history, politics, and social change. But we might also look at our own lives and at times and respond emotionally. There's a fine line between reading critically and analyzing poetry using our knowledge of poetics and authors' work, history, politics, economics, and psychology, or simply responding to a poem from our own background. If we move too far into any of these areas, we may risk running far from a reasonable sense of the poem. So, what we hope is that when we read a poem and when we use our poetic knowledge to pick at it, to dissect it, we reach a point where we are moved deeply by the experience of the poem. We ought to be touched enough that the evocative moments for the persona in the poem also become our own evocative moments. And we'll talk more about persona here, but the persona is like a character, right? The point of view, the person who is saying the poem, right? And maybe that's sometimes the same as the exact identity of the writer, sometimes not. Maybe they're inventing a character. Or if you're imagining a poem that a person who lived a long time ago might have experienced, right? As the writer, you're taking on the persona of that person to write the poem. So as Professor Knorr here says, consider the following poem, Oranges, by Gary Soto. Mr. Soto provides us with a reasonably ordinary experience, a boy and a girl meeting. What's more is that the emotional ingredient that comes forth from their meeting is one we've all felt, and most likely even felt under the same circumstances as these two kids. The beauty of this poem is that one can know hardly anything about poetry and still take a great deal from it. We're on firm ground here. We're on very familiar ground. So here on page 11, we have Oranges by Gary Soto. The first time I talked with a girl, I was 12, cold and weighted down with 2 oranges in my jacket. December, frost cracking beneath my steps, my breath before me, then gone, as I walked toward her house, the one whose porch light burned yellow night and day in any weather. A dog barked at me until she came out pulling at her gloves, face bright with rouge. I smiled, touched her shoulder, and led her down the street, across a used car lot and a line of newly planted trees, until we were breathing before a drugstore. We entered, the tiny bell bringing the sales lady down a narrow aisle of goods. I turned to the candies, tiered like bleachers, and asked what she wanted. Light in her eyes, a smile starting at the corners of her mouth. I fingered a nickel in my pocket, and when she lifted a chocolate that cost a dime, I didn't say anything. I took the nickel from my pocket, then an orange, and set them quietly on the counter. When I looked up, the lady's eyes met mine and held them, knowing very well what it was all about. Outside, a few cars hissing past, fog hanging like old coats between the trees. I took my girl's hand in mine for 2 blocks, then released it to let her unwrap the chocolate that was so bright against the gray of December that, from some distance, someone might have thought I was making a fire in my hands. Once we've managed to take some meaning from the poem, we might ask a few questions about it. Here are some questions you could ask generally of just about any poem, and you can tailor them to the specific poem you're reading. So 1, what happens intellectually, emotionally, psychologically to the persona, the speaker, or the main character during the poem? 2, is there a central object or a central metaphor in the poem that seems important to the overall meaning or your own interpretation? And 3, how does the poem end, and why does it end that way? We might tailor these for the poem Oranges to ask, what effect does the adult have on the boy, and how does the boy feel, and why, by the end of the poem? Why is the poem titled Oranges? What role do they play? And finally, why does Mr. Soto introduce the adult toward the end of the poem? These questions will help us get at the core of the poem through the means of poetic elements, but will also allow us to dig into the emotional experience of the poem and the connection we have to it. And again, Professor Knorr says this much better than I can say, so I'll just emphasize, right? When we're talking about reading poetry, we're talking about, 1, trying to understand a little bit about the author and their intent and how they used some of the forms of poetry to create the poem. But we're also becoming aware of how we are responding to the poem, right? So you're starting from sort of two different places. And if the part about the author's intention, the poetic elements, it feels too much, too overwhelming, of course, I will always encourage you for this class, go back to your own personal response. What are you feeling? Why? Which words stand out? Were there certain sounds? Were there certain metaphors, similes? Anything that really landed with you? Because that's always going to be a great place to go back to because you already have that experience. So, moving on. So, my interpretation versus what I'm told the poem means. Now, one of the hardest things about poetry is that somewhere along the line in our growing up, someone told us we didn't have the keys to the poetry door, that only they, or the poet, or other academics had the key. So, very often I hear people say, man, I just don't get poetry. People will ask me at a party, so what do you do? And when I tell them I teach poetry and that I'm also a poet, they usually say something like, oh, I liked poetry once, but it always seems so far out there and I never really get it. But that feeling didn't develop on its own. What's likely is that the feeling developed because a teacher told this person that they didn't get it. Therefore, the meaning of a poem they heard in class seemed abstract and foreign, unrelated to their own thought process. This is common, and it certainly accounts for a hunk of the population feeling as if they just don't understand poetry. Just as troubling, though, and at the other end of the spectrum, is the reader of poetry who feels as if a poem can mean anything they want it to mean just because it's a poem. Now, there is a middle ground between these two. So beyond the teacher, who has told us that we don't get it, another force at work against our understanding poetry is our own comfort with the language of poetry. When we read novels or essays, for the most part all prose, we feel a great comfort, and we feel an ease in that writing because largely we all do it for school, for work, for writing letters. It's here that we begin to feel the disconnect with poetry. We don't all regularly engage in the language of poetry. We don't all necessarily view our own lives as poetic adventures. So often, there is not an immediate sense of connection within poetry because the structure on the page is different than prose. The syntax, word order, may be different than prose, and some other elements of language used, like metaphor, symbolism, line structure. I'm going to highlight syntax as word order here. More poetry vocabulary building, or we'll talk more about this as we continue with these chapters. So the syntax or word order may be different than prose, and some other elements of language use, like metaphor, symbolism, and line structure, may be different than prose. But if we begin to gather a sense of what's coming, rather than looking up the poetic tracks and seeing a barreling locomotive coming at us, we can get on board and go for a comfortable first-class trip. Now, the great beauty of combating these two forces, language and our past experiences with poetry, is that we can become a sharper reader, able to have reactions to the language at moments we expect and at moments we don't. And the end result is that as much as we read a poem, the poem reads us. The embedded intelligence of a poem, the meaning of these words someone has written before us, comes to mean something in our lives. But not just because we react to them. Rather, the words are directing us toward a feeling or a thought, and we're meeting them in a poetic space, which has caused others similar reactions. We fit into the humanity of the poem, the history of the work, some piece of the writer's life previous to our coming to know it. And it is for this reason that when we sit around and discuss poetry, we feel a part of something larger than ourselves. And I would just add to what Professor Norris here saying that this is true of all literature, right? He's absolutely correct. A novel is written in prose, and at the same time, when something is literature, when something is using some of these language conventions, he's talking about metaphor, simile, line structure, vocabulary, and syntax. When authors are making very clear and specific choices with these things, we do get this feeling as being part of something larger than ourselves. I told my friend one time that I love to read, and she was saying, she's okay with reading. She has to read a lot for her job, so that's fine. But I said, I love it because I feel like I'm in conversation with the author. I really do. When I'm reading a book, a good book, I can say, or a good poem, I do feel as if I'm in conversation with them. I don't feel like it's me alone with some object. So anyway. Now, in the following poem, note the words and phrases that might strike you. create tension, cause resolution in your emotional response to the poem. And two, note what words might cause you to relate to something written by a poet who lived during the Tang Dynasty from 618 to 950 AD, right? So this poem's 1,000 years old, over 1,000 years old. And so Professor Noor is encouraging us to think, okay, 1,000 years ago this poem was written. Does it still mean something to me? What does it mean? Why? So this is called Cups of Jade by Wang Ping. Where the lotus pool is fragrant with its flowers, we drank our last farewell from cups of jade. You thought I shunned you when I, quickly turning, hid my face from you and would not look again. Ah, but being man, how could you know, beloved, that it was to wipe away the scalding tears? While this poem comes from the long past Chinese poetic tradition, note how the subject matter still clings to our contemporary life. I'm struck when I read this poem by this idea of the misunderstanding that one lover thinks the other is shunning when in fact it is out of sadness that she turns to hide the tears. In that line about the tears, the word scalding is the one which seems to bring the most to me. It drills into my own heart the sense of sadness at the parting, how passionate and painful the tears are. And it is here in the poem where, as I may be reading from my own experienced relative events, I'm also being led to those events by what the poem has to offer. So there's a payoff for me here by being able to straddle the line between finding my own world in this poem and yet allowing the language to lead me to new discoveries wherein the author creates for us all a new place to find ourselves. Knowing the writer's tools. Now, as readers, we need to work with some of those same tools as writers. We need to understand how a writer might use metaphor and simile. We must know something about lines and stanzas. We will certainly be helped by understanding something about rhyme and meter and rhythm. And let us never forget the persona in the poem, that person who tells the poem or what the poem is about. We need to know something about them. Let's not forget Mr. Harrison's quote at the beginning of this chapter about the bird and the ornithologist. If we come to know these elements of poetics and some techniques a writer uses, we have not become the bird. We've become a knowledgeable and intelligent ornithologist. Now, if we know that we might link the meaning of words from line to line, that we should inspect closely what changes the persona is going through, that we ought to notice any symbols and important images, then we are on the road to finding some meaning in a poem. And again, I'm just going to highlight all these lines, everybody, because in just one short sentence here, Professor Noor is sort of explaining what we're doing when we're reading poetry. Now, of course, it takes time and practice to develop this skill here, but in just a one-sentence summary of what it means to read a poem, the way we talk about it in this class at least, the way that I like to talk about it, the way certainly Professor Noor talks about it in his book, again, is if we know that we might link the meaning of words from line to line, that we should inspect closely what changes the persona is going through, that we ought to notice any symbols and important images, then we are on the road to finding some meaning in a poem. Just perfect. Great sentence. I just wanted to draw your attention to it again. Now, something we might remember is that every poem may not have a distinct point. In some poems, it's easy to find a point. The author may have decided from the first moment sitting down that he would head toward a given line or a given meaning in the poem. But in other cases, the long walk toward discovery has yielded many things, much beautiful language, a sort of music in the poem, fine images, many small movements of our hearts and minds along the way, but no one distinct point at the end. Take the following poem, Axe Handles by Gary Snyder. By the end of the poem, it's clear that Mr. Snyder is giving us a point to consider. Axe Handles by Gary Snyder. One afternoon last week in April, showing Kai how to throw a hatchet, one half turn and it sticks in a stump. He recalls the hatchet head without a handle, in the shop and go gets it, and wants it for his own. A broken off axe handle behind the door is long enough for a hatchet. We cut it to length and take it with the hatchet head and working hatchet to the wood block. There I begin to shape the old handle with the hatchet, and the phrase first learned from Ezra Pound rings in my ears. When making an axe handle, the pattern is not far off. And I say this to Kai, look, we'll shape the handle by checking the handle of the axe we cut with. And he sees, and I hear it again. It is Lu Ji's Wen Fu, 4th century A.D. essay on literature, in the preface. In making the handle of an axe by cutting wood with an axe, the model is indeed near at hand. My teacher, Shi Sang Chen, translated that and taught it years ago, and I see Pound was an axe, Chen was an axe, I am an axe, and my son a handle, soon to be shaping again model and tool, craft of nature. How we go on. We're able to follow this poem through with relative ease, maybe because of the narrative thread in the poem, and we finally arrive at this point about crafting culture, generations, family, teachers, and our own teaching. But in other poems, we might not be held by a narrative thread. In fact, the author may work against the idea entirely. In this next poem, March Walk by Jim Harrison, note how we amble along in the poem, shifting, floating from one image to another and one idea to another. He is literally taking us on a walk. March Walk by Jim Harrison. I was walking because I wasn't upstairs sitting. I could have been looking for pre-1900 gold coins in the woods all afternoon. What a way to make a living! The same mastodon was there only 300 years from where I last saw him. I felt the sabers on the saber-tooth, the hot, wet breath on the back of my hand. 3 deer and a number of crows. How many will remain undisclosed? It wasn't 6 and it wasn't 30. There were 4 girls ranging back to 1957. The one before that just arrived upstairs. There was that long, morose trip into the world, hanging on to my skin for a quarter of a mile, shed with some difficulty. There was 1 dog, my own, and 1 grouse, not my own. A strong wind flowed through us like dry water. I kissed a scar on a hip. I found a rotting crabapple and a distant relative to quartz. You could spend a lifetime and still not walk to an island. I met none of the dead today, having released them yesterday at 3 o'clock. If you're going to make love to a woman, you have to give her some part of your heart, else don't. If I'd found a gold coin, I might have left it there with my intermittent interest in money. The dead snipe wasn't in the same place, but the rocks were. The apple tree was a good place to stand. Every late fall the deer come there for dessert. They will stand there for days, waiting for a single apple to tumble from the upmost limb. Now that you've read or listened to me reading Mr. Harrison's poem, go back and read it again. This is a poem that warrants a few reads. We might initially be inclined to dismiss it as loose, as out there on the edge, as entirely incoherent, but maybe that's because we're trying too hard to find a point. Maybe we're trying to make a point. If we look at how carefully the language is crafted, we'll begin to note he is indeed taking us on an intellectual, physical, psychological, and historical walk. If there's any point to be made, it might simply be that the poet has taken us on a walk, a time when we physically wander, amble, stride along, and often our mind and heart do the same thing. They wander while we wander. And this poem will remind us that we associate our past with physical places and things in the world. And at an even larger level, we might read this poem as one which places us into the continuity of history, into the continuity of the natural world. So again, I'll just suggest you do exactly what Professor Knorr says here. Go back and read this poem. Sit with it. Right? Professor Knorr sort of explains his feeling about it in the paragraph that I just read for us, that the poem is sort of a reflection of the experience of walking. So that's the whole point. The point isn't to get to one specific point. The point is to remind you of what it's like when you're walking and your mind and your heart and your spirit and your legs are moving, without a specific point. Right? But when you reread it, do you agree? Right? That doesn't mean that's the right interpretation or that's the right way to respond to this poem. So pause the video, go back, reread this poem, listen to me read it again, see what you think. Sometimes the poems that feel the strangest when we first read them, or the most unfamiliar, when we give space and time to them, they kind of open up for us, and that can change how we approach poetry moving forward. Great. So if you've reread March Walk, we'll continue. Ambiguity and owning my own perspective. Now, ambiguity in poetry is when a word, group of words, or lines has more than one meaning. Ambiguity in poetry is when a word or group of words or lines has more than one meaning. And this may be the sole factor that has poetry seeming so hard to decipher. Because poets work with compressed language, they rely on ambiguity to squeeze much meaning from their word choices. So when a poet creates multiple meanings from a word, they will often link some of those meanings at later points in the poem. And then the words in a poem become braided together. And most strands of the braid, words of the poem, are woven. But some strands are left dangling just around the edge of the braid in all their luster. So let's finish by tackling this notion of what you think versus what someone might tell you a poem means. Now first, it's important to create and come to some sense of meaning when reading a poem. Otherwise, why read at all? So part of that lies in confidence, right? Knowing that you can come to some conclusion about a poem, point or no point, and knowing why you came to that conclusion. Again, I'm just going to highlight that. It doesn't matter that you know the right interpretation of the poem. If you know how you feel about the poem and why you feel the way you feel, I'm happy. That's all I ask of you for this class. Now that begins with looking at language closely. It also means not placing extreme personal value judgments on a poem. And it means that you're willing to meet the author on their terms sometimes, that after having a personal response, you look at what the poet might have been intending by looking at lines, images, word choice, rhyme, and rhythm. And then we'll all close to the same space, the same forest of lines and words, bird and ornithologist, and we're headed toward clear identification and a jaw-dropping gape at the wonder of a moment. So some activities you could try at the end of the chapter here. So to experience, 1 says choose another poem from this book or outside, maybe one of your favorites, and apply one of the following questions to it. A, what happens intellectually, emotionally, and psychologically to the persona, the speaker, or the main character during this poem? B, is there a central object or metaphor in the poem that seems important to the overall meaning of your interpretation? 2, after reading a poem from this chapter or another chapter, ask yourself what you think the poem means to you. Once you've answered that question, wade through the poem finding words related to the meaning you've come up with. Do the words and their some meanings and relationships equal some sense of what you've decided the poem means? Now some things to write if you want to write for reflection. 1 says choose a poem to read and then write a short essay or journal entry discussing how you thought your way through the poem. 2, choose a poem from the chapter and write a short essay or journal entry discussing how the persona changes or evolves during the poem. You also might discuss what specific words and lines led to your discovery. And you might get to do some of these activities in Canvas depending on the lessons and assignments that are available at this time. But you'll definitely get to practice this main idea that I've sort of emphasized from Professor Knorr's book several times, which is as much as you can let go of the idea of there's one perfect answer and it's your job to understand exactly what the author meant. No, let that go, right? Well, again, what I want you to do is to be able to understand how you felt when you read the poem, and then to really start to understand why you feel that way. Was it an image? Was it a metaphor? Was it the persona and how they changed? Was it a specific word? Was it a collection of sounds? Was it one of the stanzas? Why did the poem affect you the way it did? We're going to start there, right? In a more advanced literature class or in a full-on poetry class, of course, then you get history, the author's other works, similar works from the same time period. You get all the context that gives you more clarity about what the author intended, right? What the poet meant. But for this class, for us, I really just want to start with our own response to the poem. And our own response is a way to start to understand some of the elements of poetic language. And I love this chapter because I think that's what it's really about. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter. I hope you enjoyed the poems in this chapter. And I will see you all soon. Thank you so much.